Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Carey, and I'm the Communications Coordinator at Plastic Pollution Coalition. Today, I'd like to welcome all of you to the Plastic Pollution Coalition Global Webinar Series, which brings together our community to share the latest information, tips, and resources to help stop the growing plastic pollution crisis. Today, we have a very special webinar for September, Plastics and Climate Change, How Single-Use Plastic Packaging is Fueling the Crisis, where we will be discussing the nexus between plastic production and climate change, as well as how consumer goods companies' reliance on single-use plastic packaging is providing a lifeline for big oil.
A little about us. Plastic Pollution Coalition is a growing global alliance of more than 1,200 organizations, businesses, and leaders in 75 countries working to educate, connect, and advocate for a just, equitable world free of plastic pollution.
A few tips ahead of the webinar. Before we get started, we encourage everyone to participate in the polls. We're going to have 4 poll questions, and we'd like to get to know all of you better and what your interest in plastic pollution is, or what are this specific webinar today. These are the poll questions, and here is the first one. You'll have about 10 seconds to respond, so please check which one applies to you most directly. All right, thank you. Let's take a look. Okay, so a pretty good mix, I would say. People from all over, that's great. I really like that. Next poll, how are you directly impacted by plastic pollution? All right, let's take a look. So we see the majority of people are worried about the impacts of plastic pollution on wildlife and marine creatures. And we also see that we are being joined by some frontline fence line communities here today. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope we can address everything today as well. Okay, poll number 3. Which industry do you think is the top contributor to climate change? Okay, that one did work. The majority of you say the petrochemical industry. Second is energy, food production. Some are not sure, but thank you so much for sharing your answers with us. Moving along, it is now my very great pleasure to introduce you today to your moderator, Ms. Jen Fela, Director of Communications at Plastic Pollution Coalition, who will introduce the topic as well as the panelists. Take it away, Jen.
Thanks so much, Dan. Really happy to be here with all of you today. It looks like there are almost 300 people on our webinar right now, so that's great. Without further ado, the topic for our webinar today is plastics and climate change, how single-use packaging is fueling the crisis. We are so honored to be joined by our 2 expert panelists. They will be giving presentations about their work, after which we will have a discussion and answer your questions. And now it is my pleasure to introduce them. Joining us today are Judith Enck, President of Beyond Plastics, and Graham Forbes, Global Project Leader of the Plastic Free Future campaign at Greenpeace. We're going to start with Judith, who is President of Beyond Plastics and former Regional Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under President Obama. Judith also served as Deputy Secretary for the Environment in the New York Governor's Office. She founded Beyond Plastics in 2019 to end plastic pollution through education, advocacy, and institutional change. Welcome, Judith.
Thanks, Jen. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Hi, everyone. Always good to be with my allies and friends with the Plastic Pollution Coalition. And this is a really important topic. So my background is I come from the environmental community, used to work for the big guy, no drama Obama. This has made a super fun site in New Jersey, part of my EPA region on probably the coldest day in the world. And after my tenure at EPA, I decided I wanted to work on a really hard issue that not enough people are working on. So of course, I chose plastic pollution. And one of the reasons is because of the connection between plastics and climate change. By the way, please live tweet this talk, and you can tag me at ENCKJ and also Plastics Beyond. So the climate crisis is here. According to the radical fringe organization NASA, 2016 and 2020 tied as the warmest years on record. NASA found that our planet's climate is significantly changing, that the warming trend is unprecedented, and the planet's average surface temperature has risen about 2.12 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century, a change largely driven by greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere by human activities. Global sea level rise rose about 8 inches in the last century. That's mostly due to melting ice caps, which causes coastal flooding. Most warming occurred in the last 40 years. When I served at EPA, my region included the Caribbean. So I really paid attention to hurricanes, especially after I left Hurricane Maria and Irma, and I also was involved in the response to Hurricane Sandy. We know that climate change doesn't cause hurricanes, but it makes hurricanes more intense. The warmer the water temperature in the sea or the ocean, it's almost like rocket fuel. So it turns a Category 2 hurricane into a Category 4 hurricane, for instance. I worked on the response to Maria after I left the EPA. Check out that picture on the top left. That's in Puerto Rico. And the hurricanes just continue. The United Nations IPCC report tells us that we are locked into 30 years of worsening climate impacts, even if we stop greenhouse gas emissions today. Greenhouse gas emissions that are released today last in the atmosphere for decades or centuries. So that's why we are really behind schedule. And 4 years of the Trump administration made things much worse. You'll be seeing in the news that the big UN international meeting on climate change will be happening in Glasgow, Scotland in November. And one of my worries is that plastic production, use, and disposal is not going to be on the agenda in a prominent way. One reason is because when people think about the plastic issue, they think about plastics in the ocean, which is very significant. In fact, there was recently a poll by National Geographic and Morning Consult asked thousands of people, what's the #1 environmental issue on your mind today? And most responded plastics in the water. And I care very deeply about that issue, but I also need folks to understand the connection to climate change. So what does plastic have to do with climate change? A lot. Look at that ranking if plastic was a country. Traditionally, plastics were made from chemicals and oil. Now plastics are made from chemicals and a waste product of fracked gas. The US is now the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, and that is due to fracking. That is a really quick presentation of fracking. Look at the ethane flare, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. This obviously is not to scale. If you want to learn a lot about fracking, watch the movie Gasland by the amazing Josh Fox. And I want to just remind people that traditionally, when we think of greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions, we think of the emissions from power plants and from transportation, the tailpipes of cars and trucks. And what is happening today in these two sectors? You know that there's a big shift toward energy efficiency and clean, renewable energy. 70% of the new worldwide power generation investments happening this year, 70% are in renewables, which is fantastic. At the same time, we're electrifying vehicles. Not that I can afford a Tesla, but cars, trucks, ships are all getting electrified, which is terrific. But the plastics and fossil fuel industry have now decided that plastic production is the plan B for the fossil fuel industry. I want to explain that. So Why is it Plan B? It's because ethane crackers are being constructed, mostly in Texas and Louisiana. Remember the pictorial of a hydrofracking pad? You saw the methane gas being vented into the atmosphere. What's happening now is companies are attempting to capture the ethane. They are building new pipelines and then sending the waste gas to what's called an ethane cracker facility, where the ethane is heated to a really high temperature. It's cracked, thus the peculiar name ethane cracker. And then that is the major ingredient for single-use plastic packaging. This is an ethane cracker plant almost done, being constructed in Pennsylvania by Shell Appalachia. Check out those emissions, 2.2 million tons of CO2 each year. These ethane crackers are super emitters of carbon, and they are an environmental justice issue because people living near the plant, which is typically low-income communities and communities of color, they will be exposed to at least 164 tons of particulate matter each year and 522 tons of volatile organic compounds each year. So this makes plastic production a huge environmental justice issue. Another high-profile situation in St. James Parish, Louisiana, is a proposal by Formosa Plastics, a company based in Taiwan. If Formosa is constructed, it's actually 2 ethane crackers and other facilities. It will be the largest new source of greenhouse gas emissions in the nation. The Biden administration recently announced they will require a full environmental impact statement on this project. Amazingly, it wasn't required before, but what the Biden administration really should be doing is establishing a moratorium on new petrochemical facilities. And there's a bill in the Congress that would do just that, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, introduced by Senator Merkley and a Congressmember Lowenthal, would put a 3-year pause on these new facilities. So what do we know today about plastics and climate? We know that plastic manufacturing currently is a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions from about 130 facilities. In about 1 month, my organization, Beyond Plastics, will be releasing a new report that documents in detail, believe me, excruciating detail, the greenhouse gas emissions from plastic production, use, and disposal. The plastic report explains that there are at least 35 new plastic facilities that have opened since 2019 or are under construction or in different stages of permitting. So if you want to get the free report, just note that address. The report further talks about how the emissions from the plastics industry disproportionately impacts low-income communities and communities of color, mostly in Texas and Louisiana. So we want you in this work. Go to beyondplastics.org to sign up to get our updates. That's the easiest way to make sure you get our reports. The report not only deals with ethane crackers, but identifies 10 different stages in plastic production, use, and disposal that result in the release of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not a hopeful picture, but at the same time, you and I can change the trajectory on this issue. It starts by being well-informed, taking political action. The big problem is when policymakers talk about climate change, and I know they have their hands full with transportation of electricity, but they tend to leave plastics off of the agenda. The problem with that is all the gains we are making by improving air quality and reducing greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation and transportation, all of those gains may be wiped out with this buildup of plastic pollution facilities. So next slide, please, working with Plastic Pollution Coalition and Greenpeace and others, we can change things. Stay in touch with Beyond Plastics. We are a small nonprofit based at Bennington College in Vermont. Send us a donation. We will love you forever. If you're a business, we're on 1% for the planet. And I'm just very grateful for the leadership of Plastic Pollution Coalition and Greenpeace for being partners in this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith. You are amazing. Yeah, I'm blown away by the presentation. I almost forgot that I was moderating. That was really, really strong. The part about plastics being the 5th largest emitter compared to countries is just mind-boggling. Thank you so much for putting your efforts into this issue, because you're a rock star and we really are happy to have you working on this. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce a dear friend of mine and former colleague, Graham Forbes. Graham is a global project leader of the Plastic Free Future campaign at Greenpeace, which aims to stem the flow of plastic pollution into our oceans, waterways, and communities by empowering people to hold corporations accountable. He has over 15 years experience leading successful campaigns on the environmental, human rights, labor, and social justice front. Welcome, Graham.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks to Plastic Pollution Coalition for having me here. And Judith, for that incredibly powerful presentation. You're a tough act to follow, and I feel honored to be doing this with you. So I'm going to talk a bit about a new report from Greenpeace's Global Plastics Campaign called the Climate Emergency Unpacked: How Consumer Goods Companies Are Fueling Big Oil's Plastic Expansion. And what we wanted to do with this report was really pull back the curtain on the entire system that underpins single-use plastic, from production all the way to use to end of life, identify who the key players are in that system and how they're working not only to perpetuate the status quo, but investing hundreds of billions of dollars in increasing plastic production. And while this is a heavy topic, we're working from the premise that by better understanding the system, we can begin to have the right conversations about how to drive the systemic change that we really need to achieve to address this at its core. Judith covered this beautifully, so I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I think that the big takeaway to remember is that it is critical that as we think about climate change, we are including plastics as part of that. Nearly every piece of plastic ever created came from a fossil fuel, oil, or gas. And as in thinking about how these two issues are related, it can unlock new resources and new possibilities for how we address this holistically. So one of the things we wanted to do with this report was demystify a bit how plastic is produced and how the system works. And so this graphic here really walks you through how oil and gas are turned into the packaging and then result in the waste that many of us are familiar with. And so at each stage of this life cycle, it's important to acknowledge that there's greenhouse gas emissions associated with each step in the process. And it's not just the environmental impacts associated with this, but again, the social justice impacts. And we have Sharon Levine from Rise St. James, and just says it so clearly: these facilities are polluting the air that she and the people in her community are breathing. And so you come down a couple steps and you see the big consumer goods companies there that are using, millions of metric tons of plastic every single year. And part of what we wanted to do with this report was make sure that they're being held accountable for the full impact of their dependence on single-use plastic. So to underscore this point, so many of these companies, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and Nestlé, really want to position themselves as sort of on the right side of the climate fight. And what we want them to understand, as long as they're remaining dependent on single-use plastic, that just simply isn't the case. And so Coca-Cola, for example, sells over 100 billion plastic bottles every single year. That's nearly 3 million metric tons of plastic produced. And that's the equivalent of nearly 15 million metric tons of CO2 emissions from that company's operation entering our environment. And the reality is that until these companies are being transparent and disclosing and taking accountability for the full impacts of the products they sell and the business models that they're profiting from, we can't have a real conversation about how to solve this problem. So here's a few of the key findings from our report. Our research uncovered business links and sort of shared financial interests between the fossil fuel industry and the consumer goods sector. And this was important to understand that sort of, both industries have a shared financial interest in perpetuating the broken system. And so that's the first thing that was important. The plastic supply chain is quite murky, but we were able to sort of identify how these companies are related, which was sort of a baseline for us. The next step was looking at how they work to perpetuate the system. And we came across two basic ways that they're sort of continuing to advance single-use plastic in the status quo. And the first is through lobbying. And this isn't a massive surprise, but recently Greenpeace UK came out with an expose that revealed an Exxon lobbyist talking about climate change and sort of how, all the tactics they use to prevent progressive legislation. The second part to that was an acknowledgement straight from a high-level lobbyist that worked with the company to say they use the same playbook for plastics. And that's a huge problem. And so we'll talk a bit more about how that works later, but lobbying and standing in the way of progressive regulation is a huge issue that these companies need to be held accountable for. And the second piece of that is the myth of recycling. This is really underpins the fact that we have been having the wrong conversation about plastics for the past 50 years because the industry wants us to focus on end of life. And we'll talk more about what that does and how that misshapes the conversation. The third finding, again, is a lack of transparency from consumer brands around reporting on greenhouse gas emissions related to their plastic use. We can't account for the full impacts until they're being transparent about what those impacts are. And so that was another piece. And then finally, we are sort of at this pivotal moment. We are looking at, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment going into new plastic production around the world. Exxon is the largest producer of single-use plastic, and Shell is right there with them. And so this is a chance we have now to stop this. And I think that's what we all can work together to do, and part of what we hope to accomplish with this report. So this is a bit disturbing, but this is what global plastic production looks like over the past few years. And I think there's a few things to draw out of this slide. First is in this red zone. This is yet to happen, right? And so these, the money is being invested, projects are being approved, but we can make different choices. And that red portion of the exponential growth over the next 10 to 15 years represents an existential threat to the biodiversity of our planet, to communities around the world, and to our climate more broadly. And so while it's disturbing the trend, we have an opportunity to do things different. And second, that piece about more than half of all plastics ever produced having been made since 2000, we often get questions on I can't imagine a world where we don't have so much plastic. But the reality is this is a relatively new phenomenon. And in my lifetime, we were using, half as little plastic as we are now. And I think it speaks to it's a lot of this is going to require innovation. And at the same time, this is there's simple things we can do reuse things. And so that's an important takeaway as well. So here's a complicated chart underscoring what the plastic supply chain looks like and what our research uncovered. And so at the top here, you have many of the world's largest oil and gas companies, including Exxon, Chevron, Shell. You have Dow Chemical, Formosa, that was responsible for the plant that Judith talked about. And then at the bottom, you have all the big consumer brands that we know about. And unfortunately, these two sectors, again, are working together to perpetuate the profits in a business model that largely externalizes the environmental and social costs onto other people. And so local governments and ourselves as taxpayers. And so one of the things is by accounting for the full costs, the market can begin to shift, and these business models will not be profitable in the way they are now when businesses start needing to pay for the full costs of the impacts associated with producing products in the way that they are. Recycling. Plastics recycling is not working. You can recycle, a 1 or a 2, but fundamentally, plastic recycling will never solve the plastic pollution crisis. And in our report, we talk about how plastics recycling was really an invention of the oil and gas industry to push back against environmental concerns around plastic. And the consumer goods company to this day continues to perpetuate this myth that we can recycle our way out of it. And the problem with plastic recycling is not only is it not working, but as long as we're having a conversation about recycling, we are not having a conversation about upstream and systemic changes that need to happen. And that for us is fundamentally one of our big campaign goals, is getting government leaders and getting companies to shift focus away from this endless discussion about how we're going to pick up the pieces of Coca-Cola's garbage, more to how do we redesign a system as we're thinking about climate change and adaptation that moves us away from single-use plastic more broadly. So again, we talked about lobbying, and I think the Alliance to End Plastic Waste in many ways, I think, is a testament to the progress that the plastic movement has made over the last few years. This is a new organization that was formed by the oil and gas industries. They've joined with Procter & Gamble and PepsiCo to really perpetuate the focus and the idea that plastic pollution is a problem in the global south, with countries that don't have the infrastructure to sort of process the waste. We absolutely know that's not the case. The companies sort of sending the pollution there are all big consumer brands headquartered in the global north. And fundamentally, we cannot, this is how they work to perpetuate and basically prevent legislation. And so the same thing happens with the global waste trade. When you put something in the recycling bin, it often is sent to countries in the global south to be recycled, and there's just simply not the facilities or the infrastructures to do that. And so it ends up largely in our natural environment, spreading disease and polluting communities. So the hope part of this, again, is by better understanding the system, we can start to have the right conversation about how to fix it. As Greenpeace, we're going to continue to expose and put pressure on consumer brands and fossil fuel companies, and pressure governments to regulate plastic and stop the massive petrochemical build out, stop the fossil fuel subsidies in the Build Back Better Act. And so there's a few things here. Judith talked about the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. The other thing Greenpeace will be working on, this is a global issue and it needs to be addressed globally. And the US has a real role to play as a leader in bringing the world to agree a global plastics treaty. And so that's something that's moving. There'll be a meeting at the UN in February. And so we'd like to see momentum and progress there. And I think we have one more slide. Just encourage everyone who'd like to take action with Greenpeace. We've been calling Congress people to remove fossil fuel subsidies the past few weeks. Just text us to 86799, text volunteer, and we'll get you plugged into our volunteer network. And it's great to be here with all of you and looking forward to the discussion.
I will say I read that report. It is incredibly strong. And it's crazy to me. I was one of those people that came into this issue because I cared about turtles and I cared about seagulls and beach cleanups and all of that. And I never realized how deep the story went until I started to learn from all of you. And it's crazy to me that the industry is doing all of this intentionally behind the scenes while we're all doing cleanups of their trash on the beach. While that's a great thing to do, it's just not nearly enough unless we change the reasons that trash is ending up on the beach and who's producing it. So thank you for doing this report. And I believe we shared a link in the chat to the report in case anyone wants to read it. So we have tons of questions and not a ton of time. I'm going to do my best to get to as many as we possibly can. One question we had ahead of this webinar was, what is the path forward for extended producer responsibility? What are the biggest hurdles that need to be overcome to get there? And I think maybe Judith can respond to this one. I'm sure you both can, but I'll give this one to Judith.
Sure. So extended producer responsibility is a pretty bad name for a really important policy. And that's to make sure that companies that produce packaging take the financial responsibility to make sure that it's either reduced, refilled, reused, or easily recycled or made from recycled content. The concept is great, but we have to get the details right. For instance, you don't want a system that incentivizes a shift to more plastic packaging because it's lighter. The states of Maine and Oregon adopted extended producer responsibility laws this year. And my organization, Beyond Plastics, working with a coalition of other groups, has drafted a model state level extended producer responsibility bill to try to guide the policymaking in a more aggressive direction, to emphasize waste reduction first, also to take toxics out of packaging, and to give sufficient money to local governments. So that'll be up on our website shortly. And not to glom on to your webinar, but we're doing a webinar on this Friday afternoon, 2 days from now. So feel free to check out beyondplastics.org for that information.
Great, thank you. And the next one, I'm going to ask Graham, that report is just really strong. And I'm wondering, how did those FMCG, so first of all, when we say FMCG companies, can you just tell us again exactly what you mean? What are the biggest FMCG companies? And then how, if any have responded, how did they respond to now suddenly being, kind of pulled the curtain back on what's happening, that they're collaborating with the oil industry? And I'm just curious if you've heard a response from any of them.
Yeah, so we have heard responses, and thanks for the question, Jen. So fast-moving consumer goods companies, as we call them, sort of are the brands that you think about for sort of food, like Coca-Cola and PepsiCo, and then also home and houseware products. So Unilever is in that space. Nestlé does some of that, but a big food company. So it's really those big brands that we see all over. And these are massive multinational companies that are largely saturated in their growth in the global north. So really looking to emerging markets in the global south, which is largely why they need to change their business models or risk further damage. I would put the responses from the brands in 3 categories. There's sort of what we heard behind the scenes, where they had to like drop meetings and drop everything to respond to the report publicly. There's sort of what we've talked about in engagement with them. And it's been, I would say, a company like Nestle maybe not happy with the report, but I think they get it. And I think we're at a place now where there's been enough public pressure where they are looking increasingly, we're seeing some cracks that are promising, looking for government regulation to set standards for how they're going to get out of this mess. I think they get this is really an existential threat to their business, and the dependence on plastic really cannot stand. And so now that's why we're really turning to some of the bigger pieces of legislation at the local, regional, national, and then international level to help set those guardrails. So I think it's been positive. Pepsi just came out with an announcement that I think had some of the right language around new business models, but it's, if you search Coke and plastic, you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff on recycling. And that's, again, just not where we need the conversation. So I think the response has been positive, and we're optimistic about the next steps.
And Jen, if I could just add on, I think the most important thing that Coke and Pepsi could do if they're serious about reducing their plastic pollution is support a national or a state level bottle bill, beverage deposit laws. That is the best example of extended producer responsibility. And that is included in the Merkley Lowenthal Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. There are also efforts underway to get state level bottle bills adopted or updated. The New York bottle bill turns 40 next year. So there's a proposal for a bigger, better bottle bill. That is a really specific thing that people listening in on this webinar can do. And Coke and Pepsi, if you're listening in today, which I hope you are, come on and support a bottle bill if you're serious about reducing your plastic litter.
Good point. Thank you, Judith. I'm old enough to remember when they brought Coke and glass bottles in a bin that they would just refill. I don't feel that old, but the world has changed a lot in a very short time. But yeah, I think more things like that would be really what we want to see from companies. And I like what you said, Graham, that the recycling conversation is the wrong conversation, because you see that a lot from these companies. Judith, maybe this one would be for you. Can you speak about whether emissions from plastic products at the end of their life, when they are incinerated or landfilled as municipal solid waste, also has a climate impact? I know we talked a lot about production, but at the end of life.
Yeah, definitely. So this report that Beyond Plastics is coming out with at the end of October identifies 10 different points where you get greenhouse gas emissions. And certainly burning plastic at municipal waste incinerators is one of those significant points. When you burn garbage, especially plastic, you get a lot of air pollution, and about a third of what you burn tonnage-wise comes back as ash. And if it's fly ash, it's toxic ash. It's very expensive. It undercuts waste reduction and recycling. And there are definitely significant greenhouse gas emissions from garbage burning.
Yeah, it just sounds bad to burn it. I mean, it just seems like a really bad idea. So I don't know why companies or anyone ever thought that was a good idea. Here's a good question from someone ahead of this webinar. What is the view of the panel on the European Directive EU 2019/904, which addresses banning single-use plastics, and in particular the polluter pays principle, which shifts the onus onto the producers of plastic waste to cover the cost of waste management cleanup? Graham or Judith? I think either one of you, maybe Graham.
I can take a shot and then let Judith jump in because she might know more. I mean, I think the single-use directive in the EU, I think, was an absolute step in the right direction. And I think it was incredibly progressive in terms of what's out there in different parts of the world. And so, again, making the producer pay is important. I think how it's implemented in the different countries is going to be really important. And I think we have a huge opportunity, again, around reuse. Like, this is a live battle happening right now. And there's a real risk in terms of bioplastics and some of the false solutions out there. But it's a massive step in the right direction. And it creates some of the conditions that we're going to need to move towards reuse-based solutions. And so, but again, it's a live fight right now, and how it's implemented, the devil's really going to be in the details.
Yeah, the EU is way ahead of the United States, and we really need strong policies that you can enforce. The voluntary announcements are not working. Just last week, for instance, McDonald's announced that they were going to shift to some corn-based plastic and renewable energy to deal with their packaging problem. And they failed to tell us that they're basically trying to green up their Happy Meals. And so I asked, how many little plastic toys come in Happy Meals every year in the United States? You'll never guess. Well, maybe you will. 1 billion a year of those little plastic, dreadful Happy Meal toys. I have to admit, when my son was a baby, he was a vegetarian with a Happy Meal exemption. And he loved the little toys, but come on, they don't last very long. And 1 billion a year, what are we supposed to do with all of them? Well, unfortunately, they're burned at incinerators, or they go to landfill, or very likely they're littered and get into the rivers in our ocean.
So they don't last very long as toys, but they last very long in nature. I'm thinking now there's probably some Happy Meal toys from when I was a kid floating around in some, ocean somewhere, which is a terrible thought, but really good point. I thought I saw that they were getting rid of the plastic toys in Happy Meals. I hope that's the case. Yeah, and if not, McDonald's, if you're listening, get rid of the plastic toys and Happy Meals, because
I hope so.
We don't need those anymore. Okay, here's a good one for Graham. Some people say that single-use plastic packaging is necessary to extend food expiry dates and prevent food waste. Without plastic, more food would be wasted. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, food waste is a very important issue, but again, I think it's the parameters and the conditions and the assumptions that you make around these things. And so there's just so much low-hanging fruit when it comes to eliminating plastic waste. And I think in Spain, for example, they're going to, a law that will stop allowing you to wrap fruits and vegetables in plastic. And for anyone that's gone into a Trader Joe's, it's like, half the time I buy product, you can get a product in plastic and it's bad already. And I think it's like, it's just, we know we need to get out of this. And so the reality is that we absolutely we need to look for those opportunities. And again, going back to 2000, I mean, it's not that long ago, and like vastly less products wrapped in plastic, less produce. And so, we hear that argument from industry a lot, but it really doesn't hold water when you get down to the facts. And it's kind of a diversion from a lot of the low-hanging fruit stuff you can do to get rid of plastic. And so we keep the focus there.
Great. I think I've read too about food waste that sometimes, like maybe I only want to buy 2 tomatoes for my own use, and then I can only buy them in a pack of 10, and it's shrouded in plastic. And I think in some cases it actually makes you waste more food because you're forced to buy a quantity maybe different than you actually need or want. So it's a really interesting, and I saw that news about Spain, which is awesome, that they're not going to wrap produce anymore in plastic. A question that came in for Judith: who determines what the approved carbon level is for the ethane cracker plants?
Well, the way our federal environmental laws work, remember the president who set up the EPA, Richard Nixon, a moment of bipartisan environmental cooperation, which we really need today to make progress. Nixon set up the EPA in a way that you've got the federal law, but then implementation and enforcement of the law is often delegated to the states. A lot of people don't understand this. So you definitely want to stay in touch with the EPA on issues you care about, particularly the regional offices of the EPA. That's where all the fun is. There are 10 regions. I was the head of EPA Region 2 during the Obama administration. But most of the permitting decisions and who decides how much carbon is released or lead or mercury from a source is made by your state environmental agency. So for petrochemical production, we're talking about the state of Texas environmental agency, the state of Louisiana environmental agency, and they do not distinguish themselves as being particularly committed to environmental protection and public health. There are a few instances where the EPA is the lead in the permitting on some of the Clean Air Act permits, but the lion's share of that decision is made by the state environmental agency. So that's the place to focus.
Great. And I know there is something happening maybe tomorrow that I think you said it could be a good time to call your Congress members. Is that, can you talk a little bit about that? Speaking of legislation.
Yeah, so at the federal level, members of Congress are deciding on the federal budget this week and the reconciliation bill. And there's tremendous concern that these federal funding bills will include more subsidies for fossil fuel generation, fossil fuel extraction and production. So please contact your members of Congress today. Call, email, tweet at them and tell them no fossil fuel subsidies in any federal budget deal. And definitely do not allow funding for false solutions like plastic incineration, which the industry is calling chemical recycling. And do support things like Senator Whitehouse and House Member Swazi have proposed a virgin plastic tax. I'm kind of agnostic on virgin plastic taxes, but I'm seeing how, for a couple of reasons, but I'm seeing how hard the chemical industry is mobilizing against it, which makes me think maybe there's more to it than I'm understanding. So that may be in the federal budget this week, and that will provide at least a modest incentive to use recycled plastic resins rather than virgin. I mean, I agree with Graham that we can't recycle our way out of this problem, but if you have to use plastic, at a bare minimum, make sure it's from recycled content.
Great. So everyone call your Congress people today.
Yeah, and Jen, I would just add that's a priority for Greenpeace right now, is getting the subsidies out of the Build Back Better Act. And so if you volunteer with us, you can call Schumer's office and others to help with that.
Graham, on that point of taking action, what can people do against these big companies that are producing all of this stuff?
Yeah, so I think it's a few things, and I would start, I think Judith said this really well. Voluntary commitments, while useful in some ways, they can kind of shift the narrative and create space for the type of policy that we need. Fundamentally, we need governments to hold them accountable. And so I think the first things we want to do is get people politically activated, really understanding the issues so that as they're speaking to their Congress people or even in their local communities, sort of bringing plastics to the table in the way that it needs to be. And then just, I think, joining a Greenpeace campaign is one, because we're going to continue to pressure these companies. And then the other is just in your tweeting at them and being active online is something, they do pay attention to that stuff. And so it's really a host of issues. And fundamentally, when we think about the theory of change that Greenpeace has, we're going to pressure companies, hold them to account, and really try to neutralize them in the policy space where they often show up in a counterproductive way, and ideally getting them to be neutral in sort of worst case and best case, starting to get behind some of the legislation like the bottle bill that Judith mentioned.
I have to say, I initially learned about this issue from a lot of the work that Plastic Pollution Coalition did, 12 years ago, 11 years ago. And it's in recent years, it's amazing how many just big players have come on the scene to tackle it, like Greenpeace and Judith. And, it's amazing how many organizations there are and people working on this in different ways. So if you're watching this and you want to get involved, please check out the coalition, plasticpollutioncoalition.org or Greenpeace or Beyond Plastics, and really just get yourself involved, because there's so many ways to tackle this issue and we need all hands on deck. Here's a good one for either one of you. Not everyone believes that the climate is changing, that humans are the cause, or that we need to do anything about it. How do we get everyone on board to tackle plastic waste and the climate crisis in tandem? And that's an interesting question, given that, was it in our poll question or something, that, so many people are interested in plastic pollution, or maybe Judith, you said that as like the number one thing. How do we combine that interest and enthusiasm around plastic pollution with tackling the climate crisis, which doesn't seem as tangible as, doing a cleanup?
I think I know how we can do it. So I've met lots of climate skeptics over the years, some lovely people. I've never met a plastic pollution skeptic, because you see it everywhere. You see plastic litter on the street, in the trees, in your parks. So I think the way we back into the issue, we talk to people about the plastic pollution problem. And as they get into the issue, inevitably, they're going to understand the connection to climate change. So people may start with concerns about their beach, their neighborhood being so filled with plastic litter. I used to live in Brooklyn before the little town of Brooklyn, before moving back upstate and starting to teach at Bennington College in Vermont. And every Saturday I would go out in front of my apartment and pick up litter. And I eventually stopped, because every week it just kept coming. A lot of fast food litter, a lot of cigarette butts, the filters have plastic in it, a lot of plastic bags. And I was already predisposed to this as a federal regulator, but it's so clear to me we need laws on the books to change things, because the voluntary approach is just not working. And I think for average citizens who maybe are not doing this work every single day, they've got 2 jobs, they've got a couple unruly kids, they're not going to become, activists. They know that there's a real problem with plastic pollution, and we just have to find a way to welcome them into the effort to reform this issue.
Graham, did you want to add anything to that one?
She got it well. Plastics brings in new people. Let's activate those new people. And it's a different angle to addressing a much related crisis.
I'll just chime in on that one too. I think, a lot of people just do beach cleanups or cleanups in your neighborhood, like you mentioned, Judith, because you see it there and you want to clean it up. And that's a really good thing. But it's not going to get to the root cause of the crisis. And so I think we are all part of the Break Free from Plastic movement. And they have added something called brand audits to cleanups, which is where, in addition to collecting the waste, you actually mark down the name of the company of each item that you pick up. And so that's where we're getting data about these companies like Coke and Nestle and Pepsi, which I think have been the top 3 polluting companies for the past 3 years. So it's really just, in addition to doing the cleanup with your family or friends, you're getting to see where does it come from, because that's how we're really going to stop it. We shouldn't have to do cleanups if the system was working properly. So we only have 5 minutes left. This flew by. I'm going to give you each just a minute if you have any closing remarks, and then I'm going to get to some closing items and go from there. So Judith, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think the first step is educating ourselves. And I want to mention that I teach an online class called Beyond Plastic Pollution. And it's a fantastic class offered by Bennington College. We just started offering it online during COVID. The next installment will be next April and May 2022. It's Wednesday evenings from 7 to 9. Typically, a third of the class is college students and 2/3 are community people who are auditing the class. So get educated, check out plastic pollution webpage, Greenpeace webpage, Beyond Plastic. There's a lot we can do. And this week really matters with the federal budget. I've always thought that the way a country spends its tax dollars is the most important reflection of the priorities of a nation. So is our priority investing in fossil fuel or moving away from plastic?
Yeah, thanks. I would just say, I think, to Judith's point, the more we're learning, the more we're going to see interconnections between these issues, and seeing plastics as it relates to climate change. It opens up possibilities, and it allows us to see that by addressing climate change and having a comprehensive view that includes plastic, we can also address plastic pollution. And so I think, I'm hopeful in that respect, because we're learning more, we can start having the right conversations. And again, I think at the end of the day, getting active, reaching out to your political representative and sort of taking that initiative is the type of actions that are going to get us where we need to go. And we got a long road, but we're learning more, and I think we're well positioned. And with plastics, so many people are paying attention, which is a huge power that we have. And let's move it and point it in the right direction, and we'll drive some real change.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you both so much for joining. You're both amazing. And I'm really happy to have been able to speak with you. A couple of things. We have our next webinar on October 20th. The topic will be the crisis of convenience, quest for solutions to the plastic pollution crisis. So I know we talked a lot today about the issue and how it's connected to climate. So it'll be nice to turn our attention a little bit more focused on what are the solutions. So tune into that one. We'll be sending a follow-up email with a survey, and we'll give you more information about that next webinar in that email. Also, please fill out that survey to let us know how we can do better. And then one piece of just exciting news I wanted to mention is tonight is the 42nd News and Documentary Emmy Awards, and our great colleagues have made a film called The Story of Plastic, which tells the story of a lot of the work that's happening around the world to tackle this crisis. So if you haven't seen it, we invite you to watch that. In celebration of the Emmy Award nomination, Discovery has made The Story of Plastic free on their YouTube channel. Initially, they did that through September 30th, but I'm excited to announce that they have extended that through November 30th. They're also adding subtitles in many, many languages. Not sure exactly the number yet, but stay tuned for that. So we're going to drop a link in the chat of how you can watch that for free, or just Google it. Story of Plastic on YouTube. It's a great film. Please watch and find ways to get involved. If you haven't already, please join our global coalition. It is free to join, and we welcome everyone interested in joining the cause for a world free from plastic pollution. Connect with us on social media to learn more. And thanks so much to everyone for joining us today, and to our Plastic Pollution Coalition member groups and partners who shared this webinar with their communities and networks. We really look forward to seeing you at the next webinar in October. Thank you.